Nobody
Oh,
warned
it's so
Margaret
good to
Elaine
see
Calloway
you.
that
You
62
too, I've
would
missed
feel like
this.
standing
Me
at a
too.
window,
Welcome
watching
home.
the world move through glass she could no longer touch. After 38 years of marriage, 2 kids raised and gone, and one husband who left for a younger woman without so much as a handwritten note on the kitchen counter, she had quietly accepted the conclusion the world seemed eager to hand her, that she was done being chosen. That her chapter of being wanted, needed, truly seen by another person, had already been written and closed. She moved through her days in Clarksville, Tennessee like someone trying not to take up too much space. She volunteered at the food pantry on Tuesday mornings. She watered her neighbor Doris's plants when Doris's hip flared up. She brought soup to people she barely knew when they got sick, because somewhere along the way, caring for others had become the only thing that made her feel like she still mattered in this world. Her daughter called every Sunday. Her son remembered most birthdays. And on the quiet nights when the house felt more like an echo than a home, Margaret would sit on the porch with a cup of chamomile tea and remind herself that a life of small kindnesses was still a life worth living. She was not looking for anything the Tuesday morning she walked into Rosario's. The little restaurant sat on the corner of Maple and Fifth, and she had passed it 100 times without ever going in. But that morning the rain was coming down sideways, her umbrella had given up somewhere between the parking lot and the sidewalk, and the warm amber light glowing through Rosario's window pulled her in the way a lighthouse pulls a ship that didn't even know it was lost. The place was half falling apart. That was the honest truth of it. 2 tables had mismatched chairs. The specials board had letters missing. The laminate on the counter was peeling at the corners. But it smelled like garlic and rosemary and something slow cooked and deeply good, and Margaret stood in the doorway dripping rainwater onto a floor that had seen better decades and felt, inexplicably, like she had walked into somewhere real. "Sit anywhere," a voice called from the kitchen. "I'll be right out." The man who emerged was not what she expected. He was maybe 55, with the kind of tired that lives in a person's shoulders rather than their eyes. Dark hair going silver at the temples. An apron stained with what appeared to be 3 different sauces. He set a cup of coffee in front of her before she had even asked for one, and when she looked up to thank him, he was already heading back toward the kitchen with a slight limp she would later learn came from a fall off a ladder 2 winters ago that he never properly treated because he couldn't afford the time away from the restaurant. His name was Daniel Rosario. He had opened the restaurant 11 years ago with his wife, Maria, who had passed from cancer 6 years before. He had kept it running through sheer obstinance and love, through a pandemic that nearly broke him, through a kitchen fire that took out half his equipment, through the slow bleed of a neighborhood that kept losing people to the bigger chains up on the highway. He had one employee, a teenager named Cody who came in on weekends and called Daniel, boss, with genuine affection. And he was 6 weeks away from losing the building. Margaret found this out not because he told her, but because she came back the next Tuesday, and the one after that. She sat at the same corner table and ordered the soup of the day and watched Daniel work with the quiet precision of a man who had cooked the same dishes so many times his hands knew the recipes without his mind having to intervene. They talked the way strangers sometimes talk in small places, carefully at first, then more honestly than either of them expected. She told him about the food pantry. He told her about Maria. She told him she used to be a bookkeeper for 20 years before she retired. He was quiet for a long moment and then said, very simply, that he had not looked at his actual books in 4 months because he was afraid of what they would tell him. "Let me look," she said. He blinked. "Ma'am, I can't pay you. I didn't ask you to." She came in the following Monday with her reading glasses and a legal pad and sat at that corner table for 4 hours. What she found was not hopeless, but it was close. He was hemorrhaging money on a produce supplier who had been overcharging him for 2 years. His menu pricing had not been updated since before inflation climbed. He was missing out on 3 small business grants the city of Clarksville had made available that he had never applied for because no one had told him they existed and he had no time to look. Margaret was not a woman who did things halfway. She had spent 40 years managing a household, a family, 1,000 invisible logistics that no one had ever called a skill. She wrote letters. She made phone calls. She sat across from a produce supplier who was 20 years younger than her and looked him in the eye and told him, pleasantly but without any wiggle room, that she had the documentation and the time and the patience to make his professional life complicated if he preferred not to renegotiate. He renegotiated. 6 weeks became 3 months. The grant applications went in. 2 were approved. The menu was repriced. Daniel hired a part-time cook on Saturday mornings so he could sleep past 5 for the first time in years. Cody started telling regulars that Rosario's was under new management, kind of, which made Margaret laugh harder than she had laughed in longer than she could remember. What happened between them did not happen dramatically. There was no grand declaration, no Hollywood moment with swelling music and a kiss in the rain. What happened was quieter and more durable than that. It happened in the way he started saving the good tomatoes for her soup without being asked. In the way she began stopping by not because there was work to do, but because the amber light still pulled her in. In the way he said one evening, when the last customer had gone and she was putting on her coat, "I don't know what I would do without you, Maggie," and neither of them pretended it was only about the restaurant. She was 62 years old and the world had long ago decided what she was worth. It had totaled her up and filed her under finished, past her prime, too old for the kind of story that matters. But here was this broken down, beautiful little restaurant. Here was this stubborn, tender, limping man who had kept cooking through every loss life handed him because it was the only way he knew how to love the world. And here was Margaret herself, who had spent decades pouring her care into everyone around her and quietly assumed no one would ever pour it back. She had been wrong. On the morning the second grant check arrived, Daniel framed the letter and hung it on the wall beside a photo of Maria, because he said Maria would have wanted it there, and because he had long since stopped pretending that honoring the past and embracing the present were things that couldn't exist in the same room. Then he made Margaret breakfast, eggs, toast, tomatoes from the good batch, and they sat together in the amber light while the rain came down outside, and neither of them said very much at all. Sometimes the life you stopped believing in walks in out of the rain and sits down at a corner table. Sometimes the person who needs you most is the person who also, without your ever planning for it, turns out to need you back. Margaret Elaine Calloway had been too old for every man who had measured her by a calendar. But Daniel Rosario had measured her by something else entirely. And what he found there, what he saw when he looked at her, was exactly, precisely, everything he needed.